Hey everybody, this is Julie Quinn, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit about Alice Walker's Everyday Use. That's one of your readings in this contemporary section, and I think it would be important for us to explore this in just a little bit more depth as you prepare for a discussion on the topic. This was written in 1973, so it's a much more contemporaneous text than some of the other ones that we've done in prior sections or prior modules, and it's about a woman and the conflict that she has with one of her children who has sort of moved away from the home farm, and what life is like, and sort of the vast differences in Black community and rural culture within this family, right? So you can see at the beginning of this text, she says, "I will wait for her in the yard that Maggie and I made so clean and wavy yesterday afternoon." So we've got the mother, and she is preparing for her daughter Dee to show up. Her daughter Maggie still lives with her, and there's this sort of growing chasm of differences that started in Dee's sort of childhood, where you could kind of sense that there was sort of a monumental shift between the two daughters here, right? Dee was more beautiful. Dee was well taken care of. Dee understood society. Dee could read. Maggie suffered by having been burned in a house fire. But Maggie stays at home and is part of the land and part of a particular community that Dee has left by virtue of Dee's mother's sacrifices, right? So Mrs. Johnson, the mother, raised money through the church, were able to send Dee out to get schooling and go into the wider world. And what's interesting about this is that this text was meant to take place in the 1970s, contemporaneous to the time that it was written, but it has a historical feel because of the rural nature of the text, right? She says, when the hard clay is swept clean as the floor, and the fine sand around the edges lined with tiny irregular grooves, anyone could come and sit up under the elm tree. Like this sort of bucolic sitting in your backyard and just looking at the trees. And the description of working on the farm, the description of a butter churn, it all harkens back to sort of mid-century and earlier rural experiences and texts. And so when we're living this through sort of Mrs. Johnson's life and experience. And so we have to think that the most of her life was sort of prior to that. And it's been on these farms, at least for as long as Maggie, has been alive. And if you go back, you can see that this rural existence was something that Mrs. Johnson never really questioned. She says at one point, I want to find that particular text where she says, I only went up, I have a different version of this, and so the version is maybe the second quarter of the text. She said, "I never had an education myself. After second grade, the school was closed down. Don't ask me why. In 1927, colored asked fewer questions than they do now." So she's talking about living in the Jim Crow South, that she only got to second grade, and so her life is meant, this rural existence is her life, working on the farm, working with the animals, this intense knowledge of that landscape and how it fits her and how it suits her is really interesting. And yet it's juxtaposed with television from the 1970s that as current readers, some of my younger students, say you're 25 and below, you may not have a touchstone to this sort of TV that she's talking about, this early 70s Johnny Carson interview. It reminds me of a really sort of more simplified Maury Povich sort of TV show where she says, "Sometimes I dream a dream in which Dee and I are suddenly brought together on a TV program of this sort. Out of a dark and soft-seated limousine, I am ushered into the bright room filled with many people. There I meet a smiling gray and sporty man like Johnny Carson, the late-night talk show host, who shakes my hand and tells me what a fine girl I have. Then we're on stage and Dee's embracing me with tears in her eyes. She pins on my dress a large orchid, even though she has told me once she thinks orchids are tacky flowers." Now, that is a really unique detail. This is early in the story, and it tells us so much about the relationship between Mrs. Johnson and Dee. Dee does not like orchids, but Dee is willing to make this grand gesture on television to look like the dutiful, loving child. So from the very beginning, Mrs. Johnson has taken the pulse of the children, and while Maggie may be a little bit less intellectual, she may have suffered just a lot through the burning experience and things like that, that Mrs. Johnson's relationship with Maggie is much more sort of honest and true to what Mrs. Johnson considers a Black experience than Dee's experiences going off to school and moving into really sort of a different universe. And so we can sense right away with the orchid detail that there is going to, this is what we would consider foreshadowing, that there's going to be the continued tension when Dee shows up with her partner. Right. So one of the things that I wanted to also highlight, I found this article by Edward Anachi. It's on the Black Perspectives website, and this is a group of people. It's not just a blog post, but it's an award-winning blog of the African American Intellectual History Society. So these are scholars who write this. And so I wanted to share with you a little bit about name changing and to sort of give you some context or insight as to what Dee and her partner are living through and trying to do. So here's what this website says. Now, in the 1960s, during and through the Civil Rights Movement, many people changed their names away from the names that they considered were burdens passed down from white oppression. So, for example, Nation of Islam founder Elijah Muhammad announced that he was renaming the boxer Cassius Clay as Muhammad Ali. And that's how we know him as a boxer, was Muhammad Ali. He changed his name. The champ previously bragged about his slave name, but began distancing himself from it when he joined the NOI. So if you could find some really interesting history about who Cassius Clay was and who Muhammad Ali was named after. But then he decided to take on a new name. He claimed that changing his name was important because it released him from the psychological bondage of bearing the identity of his family slave master. Shedding the name was a step toward freedom. And so Alice Walker is talking about this movement in this small family story about an afternoon spent with the daughter that has left the farm and has moved into the city. And what this story ends up being is a sort of a clash of cultures. You've got the daughter who is struggling to find identity in a world that is rapidly shifting. And you've got Mrs. Johnson and Maggie who are left behind to continue to recreate the identity that has been passed down over the generations, at home, on the land, in tune with in tune with nature and family and relationships. And there's one final little blurb here that I think it's really interesting, and it's the dialogue where we talk about the name change. And it says, no, Mama, she says, not Dee, Wangara, Lewanika, Kamanjo. And Mrs. Johnson says, well, what happened to Dee? I wanted to know. She's dead, Wangara said. I couldn't bear it any longer, being named after the people who oppressed me. So then you can see how part of this text is reflecting the civil rights struggle of the times, which, by the way, in the 1970s, just because some laws were passed, the struggle was still really alive. Okay. And Mrs. Johnson says, you know as well as me that you was named after your Aunt Dicey. I said, Dicey's my sister. She named Dee. We called her Big D after Dee was born. So think about that. So Dee's changing the name because Dee was concerned that her name was part of white oppression. And she's chosen this name, Wangaro, right? But who was she named after? Asked Wangaro. I guess after Grandma Dee, I said. And who was she named after? Asked Wangaro. Her mother, I said. And saw Wangaro was getting tired. That's about as far back as I can trace it, I said. Though, in fact, I probably could have carried it back to Civil War through the branches. So this section here is really important. And what's happening is that Mrs. Johnson is saying, I haven't forgotten our history. And we've passed down names, we've passed down recipes, we've passed down practices, we've passed down quilts. We have a history. And her daughter Wangaro is less interested in those moments, but wants just sort of tangible artifacts to reflect the history. And so at the end of this, and hopefully you've read it, if you haven't, you will read it soon, there's this power play between Mrs. Johnson and Dee, and Maggie joins in a little bit about who gets to inherit the artifacts of this rural existence, and what are the value of family artifacts and family stories and work. So there's some really sort of beautiful, interesting details and discussion about that. In the end, you've got sort of two lives clashing. We've got the rural existence and the sort of the new reality for this one family, and how they navigate through their understanding of the value of their Black experiences is a beautiful sort of testament to the eye and the ear of Alice Walker, who is just so absolutely powerful. One of the absolute American greats in both, short story writing, in critical analysis, because she was a critic too, and in novel writing. As a matter of fact, she's got some really interesting histories, and I thought I would finish this by giving you a little bit of a background on Alice Walker. This is a little bio of her. In her essay Beyond the Peacock, Walker evaluates both the older white writer Flannery O'Connor, who we've seen very recently as well, who lived in nearby Milledgeville, so this is in Georgia, and the perspectives from which readers see the region and its heritage. Visitors to O'Connor's home, for example, often romanticize the house's handmade bricks. Alice Walker pointed out that it was the slaves who made those bricks, and they surely suffered in the process. As the educated child of sharecroppers, Walker can critically re-examine the myths in and around Flannery O'Connor's life while doing justice to the complexity of Connor's work and life in the rural South. So I just wanted you to see that a lot of the times when we read literature, you get sort of a little bit of the writer's life. It's not that it is a narrative nonfiction memoir, but you get bits and pieces of that experience and how it sort of folds into the text. And I would recommend to continue to get some sort of contextualized experience on Alice Walker, that you scour YouTube. There are some just brilliant videos and interviews of Walker talking about motivation, talking about writing, talking about civil rights, talking about what she called womanism. All of these ideas helped develop her style, this sort of unique, profound writing style. I hope that you enjoyed this text, and I look forward to sort of hearing what you have to say about it in your discussion this week.